Hello, Sunshine. It's Mrs. Wilbren.
And it's Mrs. Klein, you guys.
Hey, so we're here with your podcast for Lesson 8, Creating the Constitution. And our guiding question is, what compromises emerged from the Constitutional Convention? And that's what you guys are going to be learning about in this section.
Yeah, the vocabulary, you guys, for the whole lesson. Now, granted, this lesson has a whole bunch of sections to it, but the vocabulary for this go round are Articles of Confederation, Constitution, Constitutional Convention, Electoral College, Enlightenment, the Federalist Papers, Great Compromise, Northwest Ordinance, Northwest Territory, Ratify, Republic, Three-Fifths Compromise, Land Ordinance of 1785, and finally, Shays Rebellion.
We have a lot of vocab.
A lot of vocab. This is a content-rich lesson for sure.
Yes, it is. Hey, guys, and remember, if you want to follow along in your book, that is totally fine. We are starting Lesson 8, Section 3. We're on page 148. And as Mrs. Klein and I record this, we have our masks on. Yep. So we're hoping you can hear us
Yes.
Because I'm already hyperventilating.
I know a little bit on that as well, but we're going to soldier through and make it happen.
Yes. So here we go. We're going to start with opening the Constitutional Convention. And this is Section 3. So here we go. Philadelphia was already hot and humid when delegates began drifting into the city. On March 25th, 1787.
May 25th.
May 25th, 1787. The Constitutional Convention met for the first time in the East Room of the Pennsylvania State House. Hold it. I'm sorry, guys. I'm like, my glasses are
They're steaming up too.
Yeah. Not now known as Independence Hall.
Okay, all right. The delegates' first action was to elect George Washington president of the convention because no man was more admired and respected than the former commander-in-chief of the Continental Army.
Okay, now the delegates. There were 55 delegates from 12 states that attended the Constitutional Convention. Rhode Island, which prided itself as the home of the otherwise minded and feared a strong national government, boycotted the meeting.
All right, so now we're going to find out a little bit about someone who gets to be known as the father of the Constitution. All right, the best prepared of the delegates was James Madison of Virginia. Indeed, Madison's influence was so great that later he would be called the father of the Constitution.
Okay, now also, guys, they made this rule of secrecy, and they were really smart in doing
Absolutely.
this. Yep. And let me just tell you a little bit about this rule of secrecy. After choosing a president, the delegates voted on rules for the convention, the most important of these being the rule of secrecy. The delegates wanted to feel free to speak their minds without causing alarm or opposition among the general public. So they agreed to keep secret whatever was said in the meeting room until their work was done.
Okay, all right. And you guys, I want it to be clear that when it says here that they, like, after choosing a president, it's not a president of the United States. It's just the president of this particular convention.
Yeah.
And George Washington's the guy. He eventually becomes the first president as well, but he's just the president of the Constitutional Convention at this time.
Yes.
All right, you guys. So all the delegates were committed to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The basic purpose of government, they believed, was to protect the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay. In part, these beliefs reflected the ideas of Enlightenment. Thinkers like, I'm sorry, guys, my glasses. Okay. In part, let's start this again. These beliefs reflected the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like England's John Locke. Human institutions, these liberal thinkers had argued should be based on laws of nature, among which were the rights to liberty and equality. The best way to protect these rights, the delegates agreed, was through some form of republic.
All right, you guys, we're going to be moving on now to Section 4. There's an issue now. They've got to decide things, okay? All right, how should states be represented in this new government? After a lengthy debate, the delegates made a bold move. They agreed to throw out the Articles of Confederation and write a whole new constitution.
Okay. While the delegates, later known as the Framers, agreed to design a new framework of government, they were divided on a key issue. Should the government's power to rule come from the states or the people? James Madison's answer was that the government's power should come directly from the people.
All right, you guys. So originally they have something called the Virginia Plan. Drafted by James Madison and proposed by Edmund Randolph, the Virginia Plan called for a strong national government with 3 branches or parts.
Under the Virginia Plan, Congress was to be made up of 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. and the number of lawmakers that a state could send to Congress depended on the state's population. States with large populations would have more representatives than smaller states would have.
Yeah, so you guys remember all of our mapping stuff, right? Virginia had the most people. So in this case, it seems fitting that it's called the Virginia Plan. It would totally benefit a state like Virginia because they would have the most representatives in both bodies of Congress.
Exactly.
All right. Not everybody liked that. Then there's something called the New Jersey Plan. All right. Not surprisingly, delegates from the small states disliked the Virginia Plan. Like the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan called for a government with 3 branches.
However, the legislative branch would have just 1 house, not 2, and each state would have an equal vote in Congress, no matter how big or small. This plan would keep the small states from being swallowed up by their more populous neighbors.
All right. So those little guys like Rhode Island or something like that, they're not going to have a whole lot of representation. All right. So now there's something they're like, this whole lesson is all about compromise, right? So there's the Great Compromise. The debate over representation in Congress continued into July, with tempers rising day by day.
Okay, so they reach a compromise. Finally, a compromise is proposed based on a plan put forward earlier by the delegate from Connecticut, Roger Sherman. The compromise plan kept a 2-house Congress. The first house, the House of Representatives, would represent the people and would include a number of representatives from each state based on the state's population. The second house, the Senate, would represent the states, and each state would have 2 senators elected by their state legislatures. When it came time to decide, the vote was very close, but the plan, which would become known as the Great Compromise, was approved and saved the convention.
All right, so we're going to satisfy both little states and big states in this Great Compromise. All right, another issue arises, you guys, and that is, how should slaves be counted? Okay, are they people or property? By the time of the convention, 9/10 of the slaves in the United States lived in the South. Like everyone else, Southerners wanted as many representatives in the House as possible, so they argued that slaves should be counted, the same as any other people, in determining representation.
Yeah, so you got to also think, we've got this new thinking on slavery, right? After the Revolutionary War, a lot of those northern states are in the process of abolishing slavery in their states. So anyway, I'm getting off task. The Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution forced many whites to re-examine their views on slavery, and some became active in trying to end what they now saw as a great evil. In the North, this new thinking led one state after another to pass laws ending slavery. Although many Southerners were uneasy about slavery, they were not yet ready to abolish it. The South's economy was still very dependent on the labor of enslaved African Americans.
Okay, all right, so now they have to come up with a resolution. It's known as the 3/5 Compromise. After a bitter debate, Madison proposed a compromise. Count each slave as 3/5 of a person, he suggested, when determining a state's population for representation in the House of Representatives. The delegates approved this idea, which became known as the 3/5 Compromise, because it seemed the only way to keep the convention moving forward.
Okay, now we have another slavery issue. A dispute over trade raised another issue about slavery. To help business in the North, Northern delegates favored giving Congress broad power to control trade between the states and other countries. But this proposal made Southern delegates nervous. They worried that Congress might try to tax Southern export crops such as rice and tobacco. Southerners also worried that Congress would use its power over trade to outlaw the slave trade, the importing of slaves from Africa.
All right, and then there are even more compromises on slavery, you guys. Again, the delegates settled on a compromise. Congress would have the power to control trade, but with 2 limitations. First, Congress could not place any tax on exports to other countries. Second, Congress could not interfere with the slave trade for 20 years or so, or until 1808, when the Slave Importation Clause took effect.
To satisfy Southerners, the delegates also agreed to a provision known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. This clause said that escaped slaves had to be returned to their owners, even if they were caught in a free state.
So that's putting people who live in the North in the position of supporting slavery, even if they don't.
Even if they don't, exactly. All right, guys, that's it for this podcast. So later.
All right, logging off.